Santiago is head of advocacy and education for the Adobe-led Content Authenticity Initiative, a major cross-industry project fighting misinformation through robust metadata, establishing the origin of photos, video, and other file types, and the changes that may have been made to them prior to publication. He has more than 35 years of experience in photography as an award-winning photojournalist, photo editor, media executive, and educator. As a photographer for Reuters and the Associated Press, he won multiple photojournalism awards for his coverage of conflicts around the globe. In 2003, he was a Nieman Fellow in Journalism at Harvard University before being named Director of Photography at the Associated Press, a position he held until 2016. Under his direction, the AP won 3 Pulitzer Prizes for photography, as well as multiple other major photojournalism awards around the world. He was chair of the jury for the 2013 World Press Photo Contest. So we're in the presence of photography royalty here. So it's good that the photo metadata royalty and the photography royalty get to talk to each other. So Santiago, would you like to start sharing?
Sure. Thank you for that introduction, Brendan. Much appreciated. Let me get my screen up here and we can get going. Let's see. All right. So as I think was made clear by my biography, I come to this from a deep background in journalism and photojournalism specifically. So I'm decidedly not a technologist by training. And as such, it's rather awe-inspiring to be in the company of people who are very accomplished technologists by training and a lot smarter than I am when it comes to some of these things. So if there are any highly technical questions, Brendan has assured me that he will step in to assist me in answering them should they arise. I really wanted to explain a little bit about the Content Authenticity Initiative. Some of you might already know, for others perhaps not, but I think there's a value of just sort of establishing what this is, what we're doing, and going through a little bit of our progress thus far, because we've been at this now for coming on 2 years. So the Content Authenticity Initiative was started in late 2019 by Adobe together with the New York Times Company and Twitter. And it was started in response to serious concerns about the dangers of mis and disinformation ever prevalent in our society in the way that they mislead people and confuse all kinds of things and on occasion interrupt or endanger political processes, or some might say even democracy itself, not to mention reputations and other harmful effects. Adobe, of course, manufactures a lot of very powerful software that for the most part is used for perfectly legitimate creative and storytelling processes, but is also used for nefarious purposes by bad actors. And so we felt that it was important to take on a leadership role, and hence we initiated the initiative, as I said, in late 2019. As we did that, we took a look at the misinformation landscape and identified 4 main areas that we think are very important. And I'll just briefly run through them, starting at the 3 o'clock position here on the diamond. The area of detection. Most people, when they hear about the Content Authenticity Initiative for the first time and they hear about Adobe's involvement, assume that this is detection software. It's not. And when we looked at the area of detection, we noticed a couple of things. First of all, it's necessarily an interminable arms race, if you like, between bad actors and the manufacturers of detection software, with the bad actors trying to stay one step ahead. And that's probably, going to go on for a long time. And secondly, in its current form, at least, it's not really scalable when you consider the billions or trillions of digital files bouncing around our digital world. And even if you seek to run a selection of those files through detection software, it can be useful on an ad hoc basis, but at scale, it doesn't really stand up. So it's an important area and one that we won't ignore, but one that has a long way to go, in our opinion. Next, we turn to legislation. Increasingly around the world, legislation is being involved in the fight against mis and disinformation. And Adobe, like many companies, has a robust government relations team, and we interact with lawmakers and policymakers to advise them state of technology, what's coming around the corner, best practices, help lawmakers understand what's going on. And to that end, we've been working with the European Commission and national governments. And in the United States, we've been active in supporting an act that is making its way through the US Senate called the Deep Fake Task Force Act, which seeks to establish a deep fake task force under the Department of Homeland Security to investigate deep fakes, otherwise known as synthetic media, but deep fake sounds a little bit more dramatic, so it's sort of become the vernacular term. And that's work that we will continue to be doing going forward. Next, we come to education. Media literacy is a really important component of the fight against mis and disinformation. It varies wildly by country and by region. In some countries, for example, in Finland, they teach media literacy and best practices to children as young as 6 and 7 years old in the classroom, whereas in other countries it barely gets a nod or a mention, if at all. And so we believe that education and media literacy is hugely important in order to help people of all generations understand and decipher what's an increasingly confused media landscape. But the fourth area is where we're really focused on with regards to the Content Authenticity Initiative, and that's the area of provenance. And by provenance, we mean understanding where a digital file comes from, what might have been done to it along its journey, and then ultimately exposing some or all of that information to the viewer, the reader, the user, be it on social media or traditional media. So we thus became this group of major media and technology companies and others promoting and driving what we hope to become the open industry standard. And the emphasis there is on the word open. While this will be incorporated into some Adobe products and already has been, as some of you might have seen last week with our announcement at Adobe Max about a beta version of CAI-enabled Photoshop, the purpose here is to make this open so that everybody can use this, including some of our erstwhile competitors. And that really underscores the sort of the thinking behind this, that we're doing this for the greater good because we believe it's really important. And the standard is around authenticity and provenance, of course. So we started with 3 members in late 2019. I'm happy to report that now we're over 400 members. These are some of the more sort of prominent logos that some of you will recognize. On the media side of things, of course, the New York Times was a founding member, but since then we've added, the Washington Post, the BBC, AFP, Agence France-Presse, the French global news agency, Gannett, which is the largest newspaper chain in the United States, Getty Images, of course, CBC in Canada. And then on the technology side, we count with the support of Microsoft, ARM, Qualcomm, who make the image sensors for the Android system, and a host of others. And so it's a really fast-growing community or coalition. The breakdown with the 400 members, it's roughly 50% institutional membership, 50% individual membership. And we are in conversation with the organizations you'd expect us to be in with here. We recently had Nikon join, which is very exciting, and we're in conversations with the other major camera manufacturers, with other major smartphone manufacturers, with social media platforms beyond Twitter. And so we're working hard to make this as robust and as broad and as strong a coalition and community as possible. The mission is really all about trust and bolstering trust through robust tamper-evident provenance data that shows how content is produced, edited, and published. The next couple of slides here get into the sort of the nitty-gritty of it and how it actually works. We've divided the work up into 4 main areas here: capture, edit, publish, and trust. So on the capture side of things, we're working directly with the camera and smartphone manufacturers to incorporate the CAI technology into their devices at production, meaning that in a couple of years when you go to buy a smartphone or a purpose-built camera, it'll come out of the box with the possibility of turning on the CAI function if the user wants to. Obviously, it's an opt-in functionality. If the user does turn on the CAI functionality, it does a couple of things. First of all of the metadata fields that are currently generated by most devices, so EXIF, XMP, IPTC, those data fields are not secure in the sense that they can, be manipulated. And so what the CAI technology does is it secures that or those metadata fields and stores them for later review. And the other thing that it does is it prepares the image or the file type for the next stage of its journey, which is typically edit. So on the editing side of things, whether you're using a purpose-built editing tool like Photoshop or Photo Mechanic or Lightroom, or whether you're using the editing tool that comes built into your smartphone, the goal here is that every action that you take in the editing process, whether it be cropping or toning or darkening or lightening or removing something from a picture or adding something to a picture, all of those actions get captured and securely stored for later review. And so you can think about this as a whole nother layer of metadata that is capturing any changes that might be made to a file type in the editing process. Thirdly, when we get to publishing, most publishing systems nowadays strip metadata off of content, and they usually do so for a couple of reasons. Either because it's legacy software that was built at a time when the goal was to keep the files as light as possible because storage and bandwidth were not what they are today, or because there is hesitancy among publishers about distributing unsecured metadata that might not have been looked at thoroughly and that might contain personal or confidential information. And so whatever the reason, the vast majority of publishers and CMS systems currently strip metadata off of content that flows through their systems. And so what we're arguing is that since this metadata, this CAI-enabled metadata will be secure, we want them to leave it intact. And the reason we want them to do that is because of the fourth area here, which is trust, indicated here by the little eye on the right-hand side of the slide. We want the viewer to be able to mouse over that eye or click on that eye and see some or all of the underlying metadata to give them confidence in whether or not what they're looking at is what it claims to be. So it all comes back to that notion of trust. When we look at the actual types of things that we're capturing here, so on the creation side, we have in addition to the XMP, XIF, IPTC stuff, we also have, potentially the identity of the creator if it's a registered device. And then when we get to the editing side of things, we have what edits were made, what changes were made, with what tool, by whom, etc. Publishing, who reviewed the image, when was it published, by whom. Sharing, if a social media company or other distributor were to optimize files for delivery, let's say by shrinking them to a standardized size or compressing them differently, that would also be reflected. And so at its broadest, it would have all of those things on the bottom line here. But of course, we understand that not everybody is comfortable sharing all of those things. There are privacy concerns. There are sometimes security and safety concerns. For example, one of our members, Witness, which uses video to denounce human rights abuses around the world, they have activists working in very hazardous and difficult conditions. And the last thing that they would want would be to have the identity of the person recording the video on the file. And so for that reason, it's important to underscore that all of this is customizable so that fields can be redacted when there's a preference or a reason to do that. The secure metadata, we're using assertions, ACID hashes, and claims to secure this metadata. There's a number of options as to where the metadata can be housed. One option is to house it as a sidecar file to the original file. Another option is to house it in the cloud with a pointer from the file to the cloud. A third option is to house some with the file and some in the cloud. And then a fourth option that we're looking at for the future is to what degree is this compatible with blockchain and a distributed ledger. So many different options, and different organizations have expressed different preferences. Some prefer to house it in the file because they're wary of housing it in the cloud for security reasons. Others would prefer to keep the files light and house it in the cloud. So that will really be up to the user and what fits in best with their particular workflows. The guiding principles are, fairly straightforward. Privacy, first and foremost, as we've seen not only through GDPR, but also through work being done in the field of cookies and, advertising tracking stuff. Privacy is increasingly a concern. And so we want to be respectful of that by allowing people to use this technology in order to bolster the notions of privacy, as well as through the security that we have in place. Global accessibility is important in that we don't want this to be just in the domain of developed, wealthy nations. Rather, the majority world has to have access to this. Now, that typically takes a little bit of time, but we want that to happen long term. Protections against misuse are obvious. And then the notion that this should fit with existing workflows in a simple and affordable way, while being high performance as well as interoperable and extensible. All those things are super important. So we don't want organizations to have to reinvent their workflows. We want this to slot in seamlessly. And to that end, the workflows of media companies, for example, allow for different uses of this or different views into this metadata. We imagine in the newsroom, for example, an internal view where perhaps everything would be visible, but then a subsequent external view where it would be a subset of everything, in part because media organizations typically like to maintain some control over how much they show, in the same way that they wouldn't publish a reporter's notebook verbatim. They're often leery about showing everything that is done to a piece of content, in part because there's a lot of misunderstanding out there, and that gets us back to media literacy, and in part because they want to be able to control the information and control the narrative. Of course, when you set about trying to create a global standard such as this, you need to do a couple of things. And so one of the things that we were very keen to do and did in February of this year was create an independent organization in the Linux Foundation called the C2PA, or the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity. This organization is made up of some of the same players that are in the CAI, but it's a smaller subset. I think it's around 40 right now. And their task is very different. They're tasked with building the blueprint, if you like. They are the architects of the standard. They are, as I mentioned, working within the Linux Foundation. Adobe is on the steering committee and chairs the technical working group. Last month, we published the specs for public review that are available on GitHub or through our website at content-authenticity.org. And we hope to release a version 1 of these specs in early January of next year, and that will be sort of the first release of this technology into the wild for everybody to take a look at, experiment with, incorporate into other work that they might be doing, etc. And so that's going to be a very exciting time, because we've already had a lot of interest from a lot of companies and organizations about, when can they start playing with this. Last week at Adobe Max, we released a beta version of Photoshop that was C2PA compliant. And so that's now out there. It is a beta, so it has some limitations, but it's out there for people to play with. And if you like, it's the build up to the release of this spec in January. In terms of where we are, this is just a brief timeline that demonstrates our progress. As I mentioned, announced in late 2019 at Adobe Max. We had the first CAI Summit in January of 2020. That was a pretty remarkable gathering in the sense that it was a very diverse group of people in the room, representing media, technology, academia, human rights, and others. And usually with a group that diverse, consensus is somewhat elusive. What was astonishing to me, I was fortunate enough to be there, what was astonishing to me was just how widespread the consensus was. People were really excited about this as a viable approach and tool in the fight against mis and disinformation. That subsequently led to some very productive meetings and the publication of a white paper in August of last year that's available on our website that really just outlines in layperson's terms some of the concerns, some of the approaches, some of the things that we could do to mitigate some of the concerns. That's all been sort of tightened up now with the with the C2PA spec that's available for review, as I mentioned, on GitHub, and that will eventually morph into a version 1. In October of last year, we had, again at Adobe Max, a private beta of a CAI-enabled version of Photoshop. And then in December of last year, a very seminal moment, which was our first hardware-software prototype. So this involved working with Qualcomm and TruePic to get a CAI, sort of customized CAI-enabled smartphone. We then hired a professional photographer. She made pictures with this CAI-enabled smartphone. We processed the images in the beta version of CAI-enabled Photoshop, and then we exposed the changes that were being made using a part of the CAI or C2PA called Verify, which I'll show you guys in a minute. In February, we announced C2PA, as I've mentioned, and then in March and May, we did a couple of important proofs of concept with Reuters and the New York Times that I'll explain in a minute, and then lastly, the public specs out for review. The Reuters project involved Reuters news agency sending out a bunch of photographers to cover the 78-day period between the U.S. presidential election and inauguration in the United States. And they were working with the Starling Lab, which is associated with Stanford University. And they were using Canon cameras tethered to HTC smartphones that were capturing the provenance data. And they were using blockchain with distributed ledgers. We worked with the Starling engineering team to marry the resilience of the blockchain back end with tamper-evident trust model of the CAI, and showed how the data could be moved and displayed on platforms without compromising its provenance. And so the little white box here that you see, that's the sort of the Verify software in place that shows some of the provenance data about the image. Likewise with the New York Times, a similar approach. They used our approach, the sort of centralized approach, as opposed to the blockchain approach. And you can see there on the right-hand side some of the data that's captured using our Verify software. What I'm going to show you now is a little sort of small video that shows this technology in action. I'm going to pause it to sort of talk you through it because it moves along pretty fast. But I start here with a stock image of the pyramids in Egypt. I take a look here at the content credentials beta dropdown in Photoshop, and I do a little preview, and it shows me that this image came from Adobe stock. So it's got some credentials already on it, because starting as of last week, all images that are downloaded from Adobe stock will have content credentials on them. Now, they won't show the entire history of the image, but they'll rather show that it came from Adobe stock. Then I take a look here, and because this is a beta, it has a couple of flags on it that, not everything is captured, etc. So I've checked out the image has content credentials enabled. Now I go in here and I start to change the tonality of the image to make it appear a little bit colder. And then I go into sky replacement, which is an AI function in Photoshop, and I've added some sky to the image here. And now I'm moving along here, and I'm going to add another element to the image, which is some snow. And so I've added some snow here to the image. Now I'm going to dissolve that in to make it look, a little bit more credible. And there, now I'm previewing the content credentials again. Now I have this image of the pyramids in snow, which to my mind has never happened. Although, at the rate we're going, give it a few years, it might happen. And now I'm going along here, taking a look at the credentials. That's fine. And now I export. At the moment, I can only export out of this beta version. I can't save as, but that will be coming. This is just the functionality of the beta. So I export the image. And now I have to turn on the content credentials. I have to attach them to the image as a deliberate action. So I do that. I attach them to the image, and now I continue the export. All right, so fast forward. This is a mocked up social media site. So I'm scrolling through my social media site, nice normal images, and then, whoa, what's this? Somebody named Andrew has posted this picture on social media saying, I just saw this on the news and it blew my mind. Can you believe scientists found pyramids in Antarctica? This is totally wild. And I'm like, wow, what's this? And so I click on the little eye here, and it takes me to the verify page. And on the verify page, I can look at the component parts of the imagery and take a look, and then most sort of dramatically and visually, I can slide back and forth and see what I started with and what I ended up with. So that's a very simple, sort of very graphic representation of this technology in action. Of course, there's a long way to go. We have to refine these things. We also have to think about other file types, etc. But it gives you some sense of where we are right now. Now, getting back to summarizing sort of the focus. So we have the C2PA's work on the open standard specification. Like I said, version 1 early next year. Of course, that will be iterative, and there'll be subsequent versions as we make advances. Implementation. So that's working with our members in the CAI to do prototyping and implementation eventually. Of course, it's going to take a little while for the capture, edit, publish framework that I laid out. The capture side of things is going to take a little while working with the camera manufacturers, because we're essentially modifying a production cycle, and that's necessarily complicated. The editing work is, we've made some good progress now with the beta Photoshop and the verify work and all of that. The publishing work in terms of persuading publishers to leave the metadata intact, that's going to take a little while too. We're making good progress, but there's a long way to go. And also important to note that, we've been focused in on photography as a starting point. There will be work to be done, obviously, with video and other file types. And also the extent of the use cases for this kind of technology. We've been focused in on media because it's the most urgent use case. But we've got a lot of interest from a whole host of other industry sectors and segments. For example, insurance companies are interested in this kind of technology. How do they know that the picture you send of your flooded basement is actually yours and not something you downloaded from the internet? Auditing companies who are tasked with counting things, how do they know that the container that they're tasked with counting is where it's supposed to be in its journey across the globe? Medical providers, that image of a CAT scan, can they more robustly associate it with the individual patient? Law enforcement, how does a court know that the images provided as evidence by the police, body cam or dash cam footage, how do they know that hasn't been manipulated? Satellite imagery, images that would purport to show environmental or geopolitical issues as viewed from space, how do they know that those, or how do we know that those haven't been manipulated? So there's a whole host of use cases. There's also potentially a digital rights management implementation for some of this software, either on its own or in conjunction with other efforts that are being done on that field. So it's a broad landscape out there, and we're just getting going at the beginning of it. And then lastly on this slide is the notion of education and advocacy. So, getting awareness out there, growing the coalition. We're preparing some curricular materials that we're going to start to get into the higher education space. And we're looking to partner with some other folks to get this into the primary and secondary education space as well as part of the media literacy narrative. And then, for a lot of organizations, they're like, oh, that's great. What do you want from me? It's really simple. I mean, consider joining the CAI. There's no cost involved. There's no downside. And it's a very public way of saying, for an organization to say, I care about mis and disinformation and I'm involved in it. Some organizations are also keen to be involved in the architecture. So, for example, Nikon, who recently joined, they're not only in the CAI, they're also in the C2PA, since they will be implementing this in their devices, presumably at some point. And then the why is quite simple. We believe that a large and robust community can really affect meaningful change here. You can be involved in prototyping and implementing CAI technology, and we'll get some Adobe support to do that. And then just the relationships that exist between members, whether it's hardware providers and information wholesalers, or hardware providers and information retailers, or, there's any number of synergies that exist between the broad constituency of members that we have. And so that's really the overview. And happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Santiago. That was really good. So we have had a few questions which might be worth going into, and also I've got a few slides that go into a slightly deeper level on the C2PA stuff and just talk about the anatomy of an assertion and things like that we can go into if we have some more time.
Sure.
So one question that someone had asked earlier that has a big impact on CAA and C2PA is the perennial question that we always get at every single IPTC photo metadata conference is, what can we do to stop people from stripping metadata, or to allow people to see the metadata even if it was stripped? So the second part of that does come into the CAI and C2PA world. So could you talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, we did. I was talking to a colleague or an acquaintance in France the other day, and they had done a study of French media outlets. And they determined that only 20% of French media outlets maintained metadata on their files, and it wasn't clear to me how of that 20%, what they did with it, if they were actually doing anything with it, or they were just maintaining it for a future use case. But more alarming was the fact that 80% were routinely stripping it off. And I think, in my experience in the media, and I'll limit this to the media world because that's what I'm most familiar with, the whole area of content management has really been neglected over the years. There's been a real reticence to invest in it because the thinking has been traditionally, well, if it isn't broken, if it's functional, leave it alone. And that goes hand in glove with the state of the media economy, which, as we know, is suffering and has been suffering for many reasons. The sort of atomization of information on the internet, the shattering of the traditional advertising models, the fact that media gathering is costly. And so when you look across the media landscape and talk to media companies about the state of their CMS systems, it runs the gamut from sort of, chewing gum and string holding stuff together on one end and, state-of-the-art stuff on the other end. And so persuading media companies to invest in their CMS systems, I think the argument has a lot to do with what we're talking about here, which is bolstering the integrity and credibility of the information that they're publishing. And one of the more compelling arguments that I often make when I'm talking to people is that, as some of you will know, we are likely on the cusp of a massive injection of synthetic media into our digital ecosystems. Whether it's generative adversarial networks or other kinds of synthetic media. I mean, the data sets that they have to play with are huge. I saw a statistic the other day that estimates that there are somewhere in the region of 44 billion cameras around the world gathering information. Most of that information will never be looked at by a human, but traffic cameras, surveillance cameras, those kinds of things. But it's a massive data set, and the massive data set is going to allow for all kinds of computer-generated media. And we're already seeing it, whether it's for entertainment purposes or for business purposes. We're already seeing, the initial, I would say, use of avatars and synthetic faces in stock photography, for example, and avatars for business communication, and the notion that going forward, people are likely going to have multiple identities, and the whole notion of the metaverse, most recently in the news with Mark Zuckerberg and the rebranding of Facebook, but the sort of the broader metaverse beyond that. And so what all of that tells me is that as that technology gets more sophisticated, it's going to become increasingly difficult to tell what's computer generated from, or to distinguish what's computer generated from what's not. And I think that's a very compelling reason for media companies to sort of start to pay attention. And since their main currency, their most valuable currency is trust, This doesn't attempt to supplant trust, rather it attempts to bolster and buttress existing trust models. So I think the answer to the question is working closely with media companies and others to educate them about the impending shifts in how information is going to be generated and consumed, and point out the value of this type of technology in terms of helping the viewers understand the provenance of imagery or other digital file types and where they come from.
Great. And maybe I could add a little bit to that as well, because on the technical level, C2PA is trying to do something about the stripping of metadata, in that there's one thing is the cloud assertion that you mentioned before, Santiago, that it's possible to not include all of the embedded metadata in a file, but just have one little chunk of metadata, which is signed, and it's a real C2PA CAI assertion that's got the provenance chain and everything. But it says the metadata isn't in the file, it's over here, and it's got a URL. And you could, the systems don't exist yet, but the idea from the spec is that there could be a system out there that hosts that metadata in a separate place. And so if people are worried about the weight of images, particularly if there's been a lot of steps done in the life cycle of an image, and you want to keep the thumbnail of each of those to be able to establish the provenance chain, then perhaps the images do get big. I guess these days, in the age of Netflix and everything, then it's all relative, and even a big image is still pretty small in the scheme of things. But if someone is worried about that, then they can use this cloud data assertion, and they can just say all of the metadata is living on this server over here. If anyone really wants to look at it, go and look at it there. It still uses all the digital signatures and all of that trust network, trust model, but it's a way of keeping the metadata somewhere else. And another thing that C2PA is looking at, but again hasn't been totally finalized yet, is the idea of what they're calling a soft binding, which is not immediately clear what it means from the name, but the idea is you have a hard binding, which is a hash of an image, so like a digital fingerprint of an image that you can calculate by going over the pixels of an image and saying, performing some calculation, and you get a number, you get a string. And so that uniquely identifies that image, and you could use that to look something up. So you could look something up with that hard binding, but also soft binding is something where you're not in possession of the exact pixels of the original image, but you can do some algorithmic work over the image using perceptual hashes and things of that ilk that are open for science and new technologies to come up with different ways of doing it, but ways of identifying an image even when you don't have all of the pixels, because a common response to people who say you can use the hash is, well, what if I just crop one pixel off the edges of the image? Then I've got a different hash and you can't tell that it was the same image. But using these soft binding techniques, you actually can detect that it was the same image, or it's mostly the same image. And so then you can use that soft binding hash to look up these cloud systems and actually find out what the image was and what the provenance chain was. So there is a lot of work going on in that area. So like we definitely do want to encourage the news sites and the media publishers to retain as much embedded metadata as possible. Obviously, that's what we've been trying to achieve in the IPTC Photo Metadata Conference for the last 15 years. But even if it is stripped, then there are still things that can be done to go back to that original provenance chain and those original assertions. So I think it's really positive. I'm really optimistic about how we can turn that around, and we won't be sitting here in 15 more years complaining about people still stripping metadata out from their images.
Right.
So are there any more questions that people have raised? So there are a few things in the chat about this in the cloud. There's another Q&A question over here. So
Janos has got his hand up too.
Oh, okay. Okay, Janos, you go first, and then I'll.
Yeah, Brandon, just expanding what you described, that is from C2PA, it is anticipated there will be vendors who will be creating provenance data stores. That's different compared to the cloud-based assertions. The cloud-based assertion is only a part of it. The provenance data store would store the manifest, so would act as a registry. And for a self-binding lookup, that's necessary to have the data store, because both the hard binding, the soft binding, and the manifest will be there. And that's where the query would run by. So the one, initiative or let's say a side effort to a certain degree is to provide a system where the manifest can be stored externally, the whole manifest, and the asset can be looked up by soft hashes or soft binding method, independently if the original assertion has the cloud data or not.
Great, thanks, Janos. That was really good clarification. So the question from an anonymous attendee is, celebrity fan sites now merge photos together? For example, Whitney Houston standing next to herself at different ages. Does the metadata stay with any portion of the photo, even if it is cropped and photoshopped with another photo?
Maybe you could take that one, Brendan.
Sure. So there's a concept of ingredients in C2PA and therefore in CAI. So yes, basically the metadata does carry forward. So I had a couple of sort of backup slides that I could use, but it might, I'll try showing this one and see if it's useful. So this is actually a slide that Santiago already showed, but the provenance chain here of editing and publishing. So actually you can add multiple images together, and those image manifests, the groups of assertions, can be joined together, and you can see actually this image was created using this image and this image as ingredients. And actually, it's worth saying with all of this that the intention is for it to work with video as well, and possibly even other file types, EPUBs, PDFs, things like that. So all of these could take ingredients. So you might take a still image and use it in a video. That should still work in terms of the ingredients, and the metadata and the manifests around the ingredients get adopted in the larger image. So this concept of the manifest, I think we've skimmed over a bit, but seeing as we've got a little bit of extra time, we can go into slightly more detail. So the idea is that people can make assertions. So they're really just statements about an asset, and they could be IPTC photo metadata properties, key value pairs of IPTC photo metadata. So it might be the alt text accessibility, the new field that we've added, might actually be one of these assertions. So I'm saying this is the alt text, I'm stating that as an assertion, and then I turn that into a claim by digitally signing it. So using the same cryptography technology that's used to put the padlock onto secure websites, so the public key cryptography. The person signing, or the entity signing the asset, has a digital certificate, and then they use that certificate to sign the assertion, and then that becomes a claim, and all of those assertions and claims together become a manifest. And this manifest is the thing that Janos was talking about, that can be stored inside the asset, can be stored externally in a cloud data store, provenance data store. So that gives a little bit more background into how these things are put together. So I think, yeah, there's some concepts like composed assets. So that's exactly what we were just talking about. So you add ingredients together to make a composed asset. So that's definitely something that's being thought of from day one. And this is the idea of hard bindings and soft bindings that I just talked about. So you've got this cryptographic hash for a hard binding, or some sort of digital algorithmic detection of an image or processing of an image that comes up with something that's a bit more robust and can handle a bit of pixel manipulation. So it's not all finished yet. So as Janos said in the chat, the 0.8 version of the spec, C2PA spec, is due out next week. So that will have more information, and some of the questions that were outstanding in the 0.7 version that came out a couple of months ago will be resolved. There's also a couple of side documents that are a bit targeted at a higher level user that don't have to go down to the bits and bytes level, but they just want to understand how it works and what it's for, what it can do and what it can't do. So there'll be some extra documents around that which should help to explain things and help us to explain things to other people as well. I guess one thing that's probably worth emphasizing is that all of this stuff isn't saying the assertions are true, and we try to avoid associating CAI and C2PA with, is this thing true or not? So you can still have a faked image with C2PA data in there, and it might say this image came from the North Korea. What's the example that we've been using? There's some group in North Korea that's basically an agitprop misinformation department of the government, propaganda department of the government, that officially makes fake media. And they are a real organization, and they could use C2PA metadata to say, we are publishing this information. This is coming from the North Korean propaganda department, but it's still fake, and the things that are in there are still wrong. It's just that at least you know, when you click that I button and you look at what the assertions are, you can see this has come from the North Korean propaganda department. So unlikely that they would actually join in, but that's the idea. So we're not trying to disprove things. We're trying to let the good people prove that they're good people, I guess, is the way to say it. Santiago, you must have a better way of expressing that.
Yeah, it's funny. And speaking of North Korea, when I was at the AP, I made multiple trips to North Korea at some stage because we were opening a bureau there. And aside from being a fascinating, journey, it also got into the notion of, for many authoritarian regimes, the notion of journalism doesn't exist. There's no distinguishing between journalism and propaganda. In North Korea, we were attempting to, because we were regularly getting official images of the various North Korean leaders that had clearly been manipulated, and there were sort of obvious telltale signs, like there'd be a picture of Kim Jong-un sitting at his desk reviewing documents, and there would be a cloud of smoke above his fingers, where they had clearly removed a cigarette that had been in his hands, originally. But getting back to that point of us as Adobe and the CAI and the C2PA, you're absolutely right. We're not saying that something is right or wrong. What we're providing is a tool to help other people make that determination. And it really ties back to the notion of media literacy, so that when the viewer gets an image that looks suspect, let's say they click on the content credentials, they take a look at these underlying metadata fields, they're a little bit confused perhaps, then there's always the internet to help them out in determining, well, wait a minute, what is this source? Is it trustworthy? Is it real? So it really ties back to that notion of media literacy, and that's why, at the beginning of the presentation, I was trying to make the point that this is a component part of a much broader effort that I think will be important and will be successful to some degree, but it's also dependent on changing people's habits and getting them into the habit of questioning what they see and always checking the source and best practices like that.
Great. Okay, so thank you very much to Santiago. That was excellent.